Good evening, and welcome to Mystic Bedtime Stories, where ancient mysteries meet modern rest. I'm your guide tonight on a journey that will carry you far from the everyday world, deep into the mists of time and the shadows of forgotten mountains. If this is your first visit to our channel, know that you've found a sanctuary for weary minds and restless souls. Here, we explore the most fascinating corners of human history, not with the harsh light of academic study, but with the gentle glow of bedtime wonder. Our stories are crafted for those who seek knowledge wrapped in comfort, discovery nestled within peace. Tonight, we invite you to settle into your most comfortable position. Perhaps you're already beneath soft covers. Maybe you're in your favorite chair with a warm blanket. Wherever you are, take a moment to release the tensions of your day. Let your shoulders drop, allow your breathing to slow, and prepare your mind for a journey unlike any other. We're going to travel together to a place that exists now only in stone and legend, to a time when the world was younger and mystery walked more openly upon the earth. Tonight, we explore the complete story of Urartu, the kingdom of the sacred mountains, a civilization so magnificent and yet so mysterious that even today, archaeologists and historians debate its deepest secrets. This ancient kingdom flourished in what we now call Eastern Turkey, Armenia, and northwestern Iran, centered around the pristine waters of Lake Van from the 9th century BCE. But Urartu was far more than dates and locations. It was a realm where warriors carved their victories into living rock, where artisans created works of bronze and gold that still inspire wonder, and where a people developed a civilization so unique that their language remains partly mysterious. To this day, before we begin our journey proper, let me paint for you the world as it was when Urartu rose to power. The rugged landscapes of the Armenian highlands in the early 9th century BC were home to this dominant power in the ancient Near East, renowned for its formidable fortresses, advanced irrigation systems, and vibrant culture. Picture vast mountain ranges where snow never fully melts from the highest peaks, crystal clear lakes that mirror the sky like polished bronze, and valleys where ancient peoples built their dreams in stone. This is not merely a history lesson delivered in whispered tones. This is an invitation to experience what it might have felt like to walk those stone corridors, to stand upon those fortress walls, to hear the echo of Urartian voices carried on mountain winds. As we move through this story together, allow yourself to become part of it. Feel the cool stone beneath your feet, breathe the thin mountain air, and let your imagination carry you to a time when the world held different possibilities. Our journey tonight will unfold in 10 chapters, each revealing another layer of this fascinating civilization. We'll explore their mysterious origins, walk through their magnificent stone cities, meet their gods and goddesses, witness their battles and triumphs, and ultimately ponder the questions that remain unanswered about their disappearance. But remember, dear listener, this is a bedtime story. There's no need to memorize facts or take notes. Simply let the story wash over you like gentle waves on an ancient shore. If sleep finds you along the way, know that you are welcome to continue your journey in dreams. The kingdom of Urartu will wait for you there, as it has waited for thousands of years. So close your eyes if you wish, or let them rest gently. Feel yourself beginning to drift, not into sleep just yet, but into that peaceful space between waking and dreaming, where they are best stories live. And now, let us begin our journey to the land of the sacred mountains, to the shores of Lake Van, to the mysterious kingdom of Urartu. In the beginning, there was the mountain. Long before humans gave it names, before they carved stories into its stones or built altars on its slopes, Mount Ararat stood sentinel over the Armenian highlands. Its twin peaks, Great Ararat and Little Ararat, rose from the earth like ancient prayers made manifest in stone and snow. The mountain was not merely a geographical feature in this landscape, It was the axis around which an entire world would turn. Imagine, if you will, the view from those high places on a clear morning when the world was young. To the east, the mirror surface of Lake Van stretches like a sapphire set in silver, its water so pure and still that the sky seems to continue beneath its surface. The lake is vast, larger than many seas, and its shores are dotted with hot springs that whisper of the earth's deep mysteries. Ancient peoples believed these springs were the breathing places of sleeping gods, and perhaps they were not wrong. From Ararat's slopes you can see forever, or so it seems. Range after range of mountains roll away in every direction, their peaks, catching the first light of dawn and holding the last glow of sunset. These are not gentle hills but sharp-edged ridges that seem to scratch the belly of the sky, valleys so deep they hold their own weather, and plateaus so high they feel closer to the stars than to the earth below. It was in this dramatic landscape that the people who would become known as the Urartians first made their home, but they were not always called by that name. In their own tongue, they called themselves the children of Bianili, a word that seems to echo with the sound of mountain winds. The name Urartu came from their enemies, the Assyrians, who knew them as fierce mountain warriors who could appear from the high places, like eagles diving from the sun. For 250 years, an energetic people ruled a kingdom centered on Lake Van, leaving written records revealing a language with no obvious relatives, and fought off Assyrians and other invaders. But their story begins long before their first battle, long before their first stone was carved. It begins with the simple human need to find a place to call home in a landscape that was both beautiful and challenging, generous and harsh. Picture the first Urartian families as they crested the mountain passes and saw Lake Van spread before them like a dream made real. The air at that altitude is thin and clean, carrying scents of snow and stone and the faint mineral smell of hot springs. The silence is profound, broken only by the distant cry of eagles and the whisper of wind through rocky crevices. In such a place, thoughts turn naturally to the eternal, to questions larger than daily concerns. These early Urartians were drawn not just by the practical advantages of the region, though there were many. The highlands provided natural fortification against enemies, while the lake offered fresh water, fish, and transportation. The volcanic soil was rich for growing crops, and the mountains held deposits of copper, iron, and other metals that would make the Urartians renowned craftsmen. But beyond these practical considerations, there was something else, something harder to name, but no less real. The mountains called to them, not with voices that could be heard with the ears, but with something deeper, a resonance that touched the soul. Standing in the shadow of Ararat, breathing the thin air of the high places, they felt themselves to be in the presence of the divine. The mountain was not just their home, it was their temple, their fortress, and their connection to whatever gods watched over the world from the high places. As you lie here now, letting this story carry you toward sleep, try to feel what those ancient people felt. Imagine the solid presence of stone beneath your feet, not cold and lifeless, but warm with some inner fire, connected to the heart of the earth itself. Feel the mountain air filling your lungs, cleaner and lighter than any air you've ever breathed. And sense, just at the edge of perception, that presence that drew them here, that sense of standing at the threshold between the earthly and the eternal. The Urartians understood something that we, in our modern world, have perhaps forgotten. They knew that the land itself is alive, that mountains and lakes and stones have their own spirits, their own stories to tell. When they built their first settlements around Lake Van, they were not conquering the landscape, but joining their story to its story, adding their voices to a song that had been singing since the world began. Night falls differently in the mountains than it does in the lowlands. The transition from day to darkness is swift and dramatic, as if someone has drawn a curtain across the sky. But even in full darkness, the peaks remain visible, silhouetted against the stars like sleeping giants. On clear nights, when the moon is full, the snow on Ararat's summit glows with a light that seems to come from within the mountain itself. It was on such nights that the Urartians first began to understand their destiny. They were not merely another tribe of mountain dwellers, not simply farmers and herders trying to scratch a living from the hard soil. They were the guardians of something precious, the keepers of a sacred trust. The mountains had chosen them, and they had accepted the call. As our first chapter draws to a close, let yourself sink deeper into that ancient landscape. Feel the weight of stone and sky, the presence of something vast and patient and enduring. The Urartians are calling to you across the centuries, inviting you to understand what they understood, to see what they saw when they looked up at the star-crowned peaks and felt themselves to be at the center of the world. Tomorrow, the sun will rise again over Mount Ararat, painting the peaks gold and rose and purple. The lake will reflect the morning sky like polished silver, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of bronze hammers will ring against bronze as the first Urartian craftsmen begin their work. But for now, there is only the ancient peace of the mountains, the eternal rest of stone and starlight. Rest now, as the mountains rest. Dream, as the mountains dream their slow dreams of centuries and millennia. And know that you are held, as the Urartians were held, in the strong embrace of the sacred mountains, where time moves differently, and the eternal feels close enough to touch. As dawn breaks over the sacred mountains, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold, we begin to see more clearly the people who would call this magnificent landscape home. The Urartians emerge from the mists of prehistory, like figures stepping out of a half-remembered dream. And even now, thousands of years later, there is something wonderfully mysterious about who they were and where they truly came from. In the scholarly halls of our modern universities, debates still rage about the origins of the Urartian people. Some believe they descended from the ancient Hurrians, those enigmatic people who once ruled great kingdoms in Mesopotamia. Others suggest they were an indigenous people who had lived in the Armenian highlands since time immemorial, their roots growing as deep into the mountain soil as the ancient cedars that crowned the high ridges. But tonight, as we settle deeper into our story, such academic questions feel less important than the simple wonder of imagining these people as they lived and breathed and dreamed. For the Urartians themselves, their origin was no mystery at all. They knew exactly who they were. They were the children of Ararat, the chosen people of the sacred mountains, and their homeland was Bionili, a kingdom that existed not just in the physical world, but in the realm of the spirit. The name Bionili rolls off the tongue like water flowing over smooth stones. Bi-I-Ni-Li. It's a word that seems to contain within it the sound of mountain, winds, and the rhythm of ancient chants. When Urartian priests spoke this name in their ceremonies, when mothers whispered it to their children as lullabies, they were invoking something far more than a political entity. They were calling upon the very essence of their identity, their connection to the divine forces that shaped their world. To their enemies, particularly the powerful Assyrians who dwelt in the river valleys to the south, they were known as Urartu, a name that has survived in our history books. But imagine how different it must have felt to be called by a foreign name, to have your identity defined by those who saw you as an obstacle to their own ambitions. The Assyrians were master chroniclers, and much of what we know about Urartu comes from their cuneiform tablets, where Urartian kings are described as dangerous mountain barbarians who dared to challenge the greatest empire of their age. Yet, when we look beyond the propaganda of ancient warfare, a different picture emerges. The Urartians were no barbarians. They were sophisticated people who developed a unique and complex civilization in one of the world's most challenging environments. They spoke a language unlike any other known to us, wrote it in cuneiform script, borrowed from their Mesopotamian neighbors, but filled with words and concepts entirely their own. Picture, if you will, a Urartian scribe working by lamplight in the depths of winter, when snow lies deep around the fortress walls and the lake is locked in ice. His reed stylus moves carefully across the clay tablet, pressing neat wedge-shaped marks into the soft surface. He is recording something important, perhaps a royal decree, or a prayer to the god Haldi, or simply an inventory of grain stored for the long mountain winter. The words he writes are in his own tongue, the language of Bianili, and they carry meanings that no Assyrian or Babylonian could fully comprehend. The Urartian language remains one of history's great puzzles. Scholars have identified it as neither Indo-European nor Semitic, placing it in its own unique category. Some words seem related to languages spoken in the Caucasus Mountains, suggesting ancient connections to peoples who still live in those high places today. Other words appear to be entirely unique, created by the Urartians themselves to describe concepts and experiences that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. When you listen to the sound of Urartian names and places, you can almost hear the landscape itself speaking. Tushpa, their great capital city, sounds like the whisper of wind through stone corridors. Erebuni, another of their strongholds, echoes with the call of eagles soaring above mountain peaks. Sarduri, Argishti, Rusa, the names of their greatest kings, seem to carry within them the strength of the mountains where they ruled. But the Urartians were not isolated mountain dwellers, cut off from the wider world. They were active participants in the complex political and economic networks of the ancient Near East. Their kingdom sat astride important trade routes that connected the metal-rich regions of Anatolia with the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia. Caravans carrying precious goods, copper and iron, gold and silver, fine textiles and exotic spices passed through Urartian territory, bringing not just wealth, but ideas, stories, and technologies from distant lands. The Urartians were quick to adopt and adapt the best innovations of their neighbors. They learned the art of writing from the Mesopotamians, but used it to record their own unique thoughts and experiences. They borrowed architectural techniques from various sources, but used them to create buildings unlike anything seen before or since. They studied the military tactics of their enemies and rivals, but developed their own distinctive approaches too. Warfare and defense dot in the quiet hours before dawn, when the mountain air is crisp and still. Imagine yourself as a young Urartian learning about the wider world from a traveling merchant. He has come from far to the south, from the great cities of Babylon and Nineveh, and he brings with him not just goods to trade, but stories that seem almost too fantastic to believe. He speaks of rivers so wide you cannot see across them, of cities with populations larger than your entire kingdom, of kings who claim to rule the entire world. But as you listen to these tales of distant wonders, you feel no envy, no sense that your mountain homeland is somehow lacking. The merchant's stories are entertaining, but they cannot compare to the reality of your daily life. Where else in the world can you wake each morning to see Mount Ararat touched with the first light of dawn? Where else do the lakes shine like captured pieces of sky? Where else do the very stones beneath your feet seem to pulse with ancient power? The Urartians developed a profound sense of their own identity, a confidence that came not from conquering others, but from understanding their place in the cosmic order. They saw themselves as the bridge between earth and heaven, the people chosen to guard the sacred places where the divine touched the mortal world. This sense of purpose infused every aspect of their civilization, from the grandest royal decree to the simplest farmer's prayer for good weather. As Chapter 2 draws to a peaceful close, let yourself feel that same sense of belonging, that deep connection to place and purpose that defined the Urartian people. You are no longer merely a listener to an ancient story. You are part of it, walking the stone pathways of Tushpa, breathing the clear mountain air, feeling the solid presence of Ararat, watching over you like a benevolent giant. The children of Ararat knew who they were and where they belonged. They were at home in their mountain kingdom, at peace with their gods, confident in their unique place in the world. As you drift towards sleep, carry that same sense of belonging with you. You too are a child of the sacred mountains now, welcomed into the eternal fellowship of those who understand that some places are more than just locations on a map. Some places are gateways to the divine. Sleep now as the Urartians slept, under the protection of ancient peaks, surrounded by the quiet strength of stone and starlight. Tomorrow we will explore their magnificent cities and the incredible works they carved from living rock. But for now, there is only peace, only the gentle breathing of the mountains, only the eternal rest that comes to those who know they are exactly where they belong. The morning sun climbs higher over Lake Van, and as its golden light spreads across the water, something extraordinary begins to emerge from the mists that cling to the shoreline, rising from the very edge of the lake, carved from the living rock itself. Stands one of the most remarkable architectural achievements of the ancient world. This is Tushpa, the great capital of Urartu, and even today, thousands of years after its builders laid down their tools, it has the power to take your breath away. Imagine approaching this marvel as an ancient traveler might have. Your small boat cutting silently through the mirror-calm waters of the lake in the early morning. The fortress seems to grow directly from the stone cliffs, as if the mountain itself had dreamed it into existence. There are no clear boundaries between natural rock and human construction. The Urartians were master builders who understood something profound about working with stone rather than against it. The citadel of Van, as archaeologists call it today, represents more than mere military engineering. It is a testament to a people who saw no separation between the practical and the sacred, between human needs and divine will. Every block of stone was placed with reverence, every corridor carved with the understanding that they were creating not just a fortress, but a bridge between the earthly realm and the dwelling places of the gods. As you climb the ancient pathways that wind up the face of the rock, feel the smooth stone beneath your feet, worn by countless generations of Urartian footsteps. The passages are narrow and steep, designed to channel visitors along specific routes, but they are also beautiful, carved with a precision that speaks of deep respect for the stone itself. Here and there, you might notice small niches cut into the walls, places where oil lamps once flickered, casting dancing shadows on the carved surfaces. The Urartians were perhaps the finest stone workers of their age, and their techniques remain mysterious even to modern architects. They could cut blocks so precisely that no mortar was needed to hold them together, fitting massive stones together with joints so tight that even today you cannot slip a knife blade between them. Yet their walls were not cold or forbidding. Something in the way they shaped and placed each stone gave their buildings a quality of warmth, as if the very rocks were alive and breathing. Water was sacred to the Urartians, and nowhere is this more evident than in their architectural achievements. Throughout the fortress of Tushpa, you can still trace the remains of an elaborate system of channels, cisterns, and pools that brought the life-giving waters of the lake into the very heart of the stone citadel. But this was more than mere practical engineering. The Urartians understood water as a manifestation of divine blessing, and they incorporated it into their buildings as both a practical necessity and a spiritual element. Picture yourself standing in what was once the central courtyard of the royal palace, now open to the sky, but still retaining traces of its former grandeur. In the center, a stone-lined pool reflects the passing clouds, fed by channels that carry water from hidden springs high in the mountain. The sound of running water creates a constant, gentle murmur that seems to speak in some ancient language, telling stories of kings and queens who once walked these same stones. The Urartians developed a unique architectural style that has no parallel anywhere else in the ancient world. Their buildings seemed to grow from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. Walls follow the natural contours of the rock, incorporating existing cliff faces and stone formations into the overall design. Rooms are carved directly into the mountainside, their walls polished smooth and decorated with reliefs that seemed to dance in the lamplight. But Tushpa was only the beginning. Throughout their kingdom, the Urartians built fortress cities that defied both human enemies and the challenging mountain environment. Erebuni, built by King Arjiti in what is now the city of Yerevan, stood guard over the northern approaches to the kingdom. Its massive walls, built from blocks of basalt that gleamed like black glass in the sunlight, could be seen from miles away, a clear statement that this land was protected by powers both human and divine. Each Urartian fortress was positioned with careful attention to both military strategy and spiritual significance. They chose sites that commanded wide views of the surrounding landscape, places where watchmen could see approaching friends or enemies from great distances. But they also chose locations that felt touched by the sacred, high places where the boundary between earth and sky seemed thin, where the gods might more easily hear the prayers of their people. The building of these great fortresses required not just engineering skill, but profound community cooperation. Imagine the scene during the construction of a new citadel. Thousands of workers moving in careful coordination. Stonemasons shape massive blocks with tools of bronze and iron, their hammers ringing against the stone in rhythms that seem almost musical. Teams of oxen strain to haul the finished blocks up winding mountain paths, while engineers direct the placement of each stone according to plans that exist only in their trained memories. But this was not forced labor. The Urartians built their cities with the willing participation of their entire society, from the highest nobles to the humblest farmers. Each person understood that they were participating in something larger than themselves, contributing to structures that would protect and inspire their descendants for generations to come. The work was hard, yes, but it was also sacred work, a form of prayer offered in stone and sweat and shared effort. Water management was perhaps the Urartians' greatest technological achievement, and nowhere was this more impressive than in their cities. They carved elaborate tunnel systems through solid rock, creating aqueducts that could carry fresh water across miles of difficult terrain. They built sophisticated irrigation networks that turned mountainous valleys into productive farmland. Most remarkably, they created underground cisterns capable of storing vast quantities of water, ensuring that their fortress cities could withstand even lengthy sieges. The canal system around Lake Van was a marvel of ancient engineering that transformed the entire region. Channels carved from living rock directed water from mountain streams to fields and gardens, while carefully constructed dams created reservoirs that could supply water during the dry months. But again, this was more than mere practicality. Water was the gift of the gods, and managing it properly was both a technical challenge and a religious duty. As evening approaches in our imagined journey through ancient Tushpa, torches begin to flicker to life in wall niches throughout the fortress. The stone passages that seemed austere in daylight take on a warm, golden glow, and the sound of water becomes more noticeable in the gathering quiet. Guards take their positions on the high walls, their bronze-tipped spears gleaming in the torchlight, as they begin their night-long watch over the kingdom. From the highest tower of the citadel, you can see the lights of other settlements scattered around the lake, each one a small star reflecting the greater constellation of Urartian civilization. Fishing boats move slowly across the dark water, their oil lamps creating trails of light that dance and shimmer on the gentle waves. The air is filled with the sense of wood smoke and cooking food, the everyday smells of a people at peace in their mountain home. The Urartians built for eternity, and in many ways they succeeded. Their stone fortresses have outlasted empires. that once seemed infinitely more powerful. The foundations they laid still support buildings in modern cities. The water channels they carved still carry the precious gift of the mountains to the valleys below. Most importantly, the harmony they achieved between human ambition and natural landscape still has the power to inspire us today. As Chapter 3 draws to a close, let yourself rest within the stone walls of ancient Tushpa. Feel the solid strength of the bedrock beneath you, the patient endurance of walls that have weathered thousands of mountain winters. Listen to the eternal murmur of sacred waters, the sound that lulled Urartian kings and queens to sleep in this very place centuries ago. You are safe here, protected by stones that were placed with love and reverence, surrounded by the careful work of people who understood that true security comes not from dominating the landscape, but from learning to live in harmony with it. The fortress walls embrace you like gentle arms, and the sound of flowing water carries you toward dreams of ancient engineering marvels and sacred architectural wonders. Sleep now in the peace of stone and starlight, knowing that some human achievements are so beautiful and enduring that they become part of the eternal landscape itself. Tomorrow, we will meet the gods and goddesses who blessed these works and guided the hands that built them. But tonight, rest in the quiet strength of Urartian stone, where the dreams of ancient builders still echo in every perfectly fitted block. In the deep quiet of the mountain night, when the last torches have burned low in the fortress walls, and the lake lies still as polished obsidian beneath the stars, something stirs in the sacred places of Urartu. It is not quite sound, not quite movement, but rather a presence that seems to flow through the carved stone corridors and gather in the temple chambers, where priests once offered their prayers to gods whose names still echo with ancient power. The greatest of these divine beings was Haldi, whose name the Urartians spoke with the same reverence that others reserve for their most sacred oaths. Haldi was not merely a god among gods. He was the supreme deity of the Urartian pantheon, the lord of war and wisdom, the protector of the kingdom, and the guardian of its people. To understand Haldi is to understand the very heart of Urartian civilization, for in his worship they found both the courage to defend their mountain realm and the wisdom to govern it justly. Picture the great temple of Haldi as it might have appeared on a feast day in the height of Urartian power. The massive stone altar, carved from a single block of basalt, gleams in the light of hundreds of oil lamps. The air is thick with the smoke of burning incense, cedar and frankincense, and herbs gathered from the high mountain meadows. Priests, in robes of finest wool, move with practiced grace through rituals that have been performed for generations, their voices rising and falling in chants that seem to make the very stones vibrate with divine energy. But Haldi was more than a distant, fearsome deity to be appeased with offerings and prayers. The Urartians understood their god as an active presence in their daily lives, a divine force that moved through their world like wind through the mountain passes. When Urartian warriors rode out to defend their borders, they carried Haldi's symbol on their shields and weapons. When farmers planted their crops in the spring, they invoked Haldi's blessing on the seeds. When children were born, they were presented to Haldi in ceremonies that welcomed them into the community of the faithful. The symbol of Haldi was as distinctive as it was powerful, a figure that combined human and divine elements in ways that spoke to the Urartian understanding of the relationship between mortal and immortal realms. Often depicted standing on the back of a lion, Haldi appeared as a bearded god wearing a tall, conical cap that marked him as a deity of the mountains. In one hand, he might hold a bow, symbol of the hunter's skill and the warrior's prowess. In the other, he might carry a spear, or a symbol of divine authority. But perhaps the most striking aspect of Haldi's iconography was his association with the sacred tree of life, a symbol that appears throughout Urartian art and seems to represent the connection between the earthly and heavenly realms. This was not simply a decorative motif, but but a profound statement about the nature of existence itself. Like the tree, which draws sustenance from the earth through its roots while reaching toward heaven with its branches, the Urartians saw themselves as beings who belonged to both worlds, mortal creatures touched by divine purpose. Accompanying Haldi in the Urartian pantheon were other deities, each with their own sphere of influence and their own devoted followers. Tishiba, the god of storms and weather, commanded the lightning that split the mountain peaks and the winds that brought the life-giving rains. His voice was heard in the thunder that rolled across Lake Van during the fierce storms of winter, and his blessing was sought by all who depended on the changing seasons for their livelihood. Shivini, the sun god, brought light and warmth to the mountain kingdom, his daily journey across the sky marking the rhythm of Urartian life. But Shivini was more than merely the physical sun. He represented enlightenment, wisdom, and the divine light that illuminated the darkness of ignorance and fear. Urartian kings claimed special relationship with Shivini, presenting themselves as earthly representatives of the sun god's divine authority. The goddess Arubani watched over fertility and harvest, her gentle influence ensuring that the mountain valleys produced abundant crops despite the challenging climate. She was particularly beloved by women, who saw in her both the nurturing mother and the wise crone who understood the mysteries of life and death. Her festivals, celebrated at the turning of the seasons, brought together entire communities in joyous celebration of the earth's continuing generosity. But the Urartian understanding of the divine extended far beyond these major deities. They populated their world with a rich array of spirits and supernatural beings, each connected to specific places, activities, or aspects of daily life. Mountain peaks had their guardian spirits, as did springs and groves, and even individual trees that had grown to impressive size or unusual shape. The lake itself was home to water spirits, who could be benevolent or dangerous, depending on how respectfully they were approached. This animistic understanding of the world meant that every Urartian lived in constant awareness of the sacred. A farmer plowing his field was not simply breaking soil, but was engaged in a dialogue with the earth spirits who controlled fertility. A craftsman shaping bronze was not merely working metal, but was participating in a sacred act of transformation that connected him to the divine forces of creation. A mother singing her child to sleep was not simply providing comfort, but was invoking the protection of benevolent spirits who watched over the innocent. The sacred symbols of Urartu were carved into stone, cast in bronze, and woven into textiles with an artistry that still amazes modern observers. The winged disk of the sun, the sacred tree with its complex branches and roots, the figure of Haldi standing triumphant over his enemies. These images appeared everywhere in Urartian art and architecture, constant reminders of the divine presence that permeated all aspects of life. Eagles soared through Urartian symbolism as messengers between earth and sky, their keen eyes representing divine wisdom and their powerful wings symbolizing the soul's ability to rise above earthly concerns. Lions embodied royal power and divine strength, while bulls represented the fertile energy of the earth itself. Each animal, each plant, each natural phenomenon had its place in the complex web of meaning that the Urartians wove around their daily existence. The influence of Urartian religious beliefs extended far beyond the borders of their mountain kingdom, and far beyond the centuries of their political existence. When Christianity came to Armenia, many Urartian sacred sites were transformed into churches, and some scholars believe that certain Christian traditions in the region preserve echoes of much older Urartian practices. The Armenian Apostolic Church, one of the world's oldest Christian communities, may carry within its rituals and beliefs traces of the ancient mountain faith that once centered on Haldi and his divine companions. As you rest here in the quiet darkness Let yourself feel the presence of those ancient powers that the Urartians knew so well. Not as fearsome judges or demanding tyrants, but as benevolent forces that permeate the natural world and offer guidance and protection to those who approach them with reverence and understanding. Feel the protective strength of Haldi, the nurturing presence of Arubani, the illuminating wisdom of Shivini flowing around you like a gentle current of divine energy. The sacred symbols carved in Urartian stone were not mere decorations, but windows into a world where the divine and mortal realms touched and interpenetrated at every moment. The tree of life that appears so often in their art was not just an abstract concept, but a living reality, a cosmic axis that connected the depths of the earth with the heights of heaven, with human beings living and moving along its length like leaves dancing in a sacred wind dot in the temple chambers of ancient Tushpa. Oil lamps burned through the night, their steady flames representing the eternal presence of the divine in the world. Priests maintained these sacred fires year after year, generation after generation, understanding that their vigilance was part of a cosmic responsibility to keep the connection between heaven and earth alive and strong. Those flames have long since been extinguished, but something of their light remains, waiting to be rekindled in hearts that still remember how to see the sacred in the everyday world. As chapter 4 draws toward its peaceful conclusion, allow yourself to be embraced by the same divine presence that comforted the Urartians through long mountain winters and guided them through the challenges of building a civilization in one of the world's most demanding environments. You are not alone in the darkness. The same forces that watched over ancient Tushpa are watching over you now. The same divine light that illuminated Urartian temples is shining gently on your rest. Sleep comes more easily when we remember that we are part of something larger than ourselves, that the same sacred patterns that the Urartians recognized in their mountain world continue to operate in our own lives. The tree of life still grows, its roots deep in the earth of human experience, its branches reaching toward mysteries we are only beginning to understand. Rest now in its shade, protected by its strength, nourished by its eternal wisdom. The mountain wind carries whispers of ancient courage across the high passes tonight, echoes of a time when the fate of kingdoms hung in the balance, and the children of Ararat stood firm against forces that sought to sweep them from their sacred homeland. But these are not tales of mindless violence or conquest for its own sake. These are stories of a people defending what they held most dear, fighting not just for territory or treasure, but for the right to continue their unique way of life in the mountains they considered blessed by the gods. Picture the scene as dawn breaks over the Urartian borderlands in the 8th century before our common era. Mist clings to the valleys like ghostly fingers, and the peaks of distant mountains catch a first pale light of morning. From a watchtower carved into the living rock, a Urartian sentinel peers southward toward the lands of Assyria, that great empire that had already swallowed so many smaller kingdoms and now cast covetous eyes toward the rich highlands around. Lake Van. The Assyrians were master chroniclers, and it is largely through their royal annals that we hear the thunderous clash of these ancient conflicts. But their records, carved in cuneiform on palace walls in distant Nineveh, tell only one side of the story. They speak of rebellious mountain tribes that dared to defy the will of the great king, of barbarian chieftains who needed to be taught proper respect for Assyrian authority. Yet between the lines of their boastful inscriptions, we can glimpse a different truth, a recognition that these mountain people were unlike any enemy they had faced before. The Urartians did not fight like the river valley peoples the Assyrians were accustomed to conquering. They understood their mountainous terrain with an intimacy that came from generations of living among the peaks and passes. When Assyrian armies advanced along the obvious routes, following river valleys and established roads, Urartian forces seemed to materialize from the very stones themselves, striking swiftly and then vanishing back into landscapes that swallowed pursuing. Armies like morning mist swallows the unwary traveler. King Sarduri, whose name means gift of the sun god, epitomized the Urartian approach to warfare. Unlike the Assyrian monarchs, who fought from golden chariots, surrounded by elaborate bodyguards, Sarduri led his warriors on foot through mountain paths where horses could not follow. He knew every hidden valley, every secret spring, every cave that could shelter a wounded warrior or conceal an ambush. Most importantly, he understood that he was not fighting merely for political advantage, but for the survival of a sacred trust. Imagine yourself as a young Urartian warrior, bronze spear in hand, standing in the pre-dawn darkness with your companions. On a ridge overlooking an Assyrian camp, the enemy tents spread below you like mushrooms after rain. Thousands of soldiers from the lowlands who have marched far from home in service to their imperial master. Their campfires flicker like fallen stars, and you can hear the distant murmur of foreign voices speaking in tongues that sound harsh and guttural, compared to the flowing syllables of your mountain language. Your captain, a grizzled veteran whose scars tell stories of a dozen battles, places a reassuring hand on your shoulder. He has served under 3 kings and knows the weight of defending not just territory, but an entire way of life. Remember, he whispers, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind, we fight not for conquest, but for continuation. These invaders seek to make our children speak their language, worship their gods, build their cities. We fight so that the songs of our mothers will still be sung when their empire is dust. The Urartian military was built around this understanding of defensive warfare. Their weapons were crafted not for aggressive expansion, but for the protection of their homeland. Urartian smiths, working with iron and bronze in forges that glowed like captured pieces of the sun, created spear points that could penetrate enemy armor and swords that held their edge through the longest battles. But more than superior metallurgy, the Urartians possessed something their enemies lacked, the desperate courage of people fighting on their own sacred ground. Their fortress cities were designed as much for warfare as for daily life. Every corridor could become a killing field, every courtyard a place of last stand. The water systems that brought life to the mountain citadels could be defended even under siege, allowing Urartian garrisons to hold out for months while enemy armies withered in the harsh mountain climate. Most cunningly, the Urartians built secret passages and hidden chambers within their fortresses, allowing defenders to appear and disappear like mountain spirits. But perhaps the most formidable Urartian weapon was their intimate knowledge of weather and terrain. Assyrian armies, accustomed to the predictable seasons of Mesopotamia, found themselves trapped by sudden mountain storms that turned familiar paths into treacherous death traps. Urartian forces, reading signs in cloud formations and wind patterns that their enemies could not even perceive, struck when conditions favored the defenders and melted away when nature herself became their ally. King Arishti I, builder of cities and conqueror of territories, showed that the Urartians could be formidable in offensive warfare as well. Under his leadership, Urartian armies expanded northward into the Caucasus and westward toward the Black Sea, not as raiders seeking plunder, but as founders establishing new fortress cities that would extend the protection of Haldi to previously undefended peoples. Argishti's campaigns were military expeditions and colonization efforts combined, spreading Urartian civilization through the establishment of strongholds that became centers of culture and trade. The most famous of Argishti's foundations was Erebuni, built in 782 BCE on a commanding hilltop that would one day become the city of Yerevan. The inscription he left to commemorate this achievement speaks not of conquered enemies or captured treasure, but of bringing the blessings of civilized life to a new region. By the greatness of Haldi, Argishti, son of Menua, built this mighty fortress and gave it the name Erebuni for the glory of Bienili and to instill fear in enemy lands. Even in warfare, the Urartians maintained their connection to the sacred. Before every battle, priests offered sacrifices to Haldi and the other gods, seeking not just victory, but divine guidance in the conduct of war. Urartian warriors carried amulets bearing sacred symbols, and their weapons were blessed in temple ceremonies that connected the physical act of fighting to the spiritual duty of protecting what the gods had entrusted to their care, the night. Battles were perhaps the most legendary of Urartian military tactics. Moving through terrain they knew as intimately as their own heartbeats, Urartian forces could navigate by starlight through mountain passes that would baffle enemies even in broad daylight. They struck enemy camps in the darkest hours before dawn, when human vigilance is naturally at its lowest ebb, appearing like shadows given deadly form and vanishing again before organized resistance could form. But these conflicts were not endless cycles of violence. The Urartians understood the value of diplomacy and strategic alliance, as well as military prowess. King Rusahai, perhaps the greatest of the Urartian monarchs, balanced warfare with statecraft, building a network of tributary relationships that extended Urartian influence far beyond what military force alone could have accomplished. Under his reign, Urartu reached its greatest territorial extent and cultural influence. The archaeological evidence of these ancient conflicts tells its own story. Bronze arrowheads and spear points still emerge from mountain battlefields, their metal green with age, but their points still sharp after nearly 3 millennia. Fortress walls bear the scars of siege warfare, while hidden chambers reveal caches of weapons and supplies stored against times of greatest danger. Most poignantly, burial sites contain the remains of warriors laid to rest with their weapons and armor, final testimony to lives spent in defense of homeland and faith. As the moon rises over the ancient battlefields tonight, casting silver light on stones that once ran red with the blood of heroes, we can almost hear the distant echo of bronze clashing against bronze, the war cries of men fighting for more than their own lives. But there is no horror in these sounds, no celebration of violence for its own sake. Instead, there is something infinitely noble about the courage of people who stood their ground when surrender would have been easier, who chose to fight rather than see their children raised as strangers to their own heritage. The Urartian approach to warfare reflected their understanding of cosmic balance. They fought when fighting was necessary, but they also knew when to seek peace. Their conflicts with Assyria and other powers were punctuated by periods of diplomatic relations and cultural exchange. Even their enemies came to respect the military prowess and cultural sophistication of the Mountain Kingdom, recognizing that the Urartians had created something worth defending. Let yourself feel the protective strength that surrounded the ancient Urartian homeland. You are safe now as they made their people safe, protected by the courage of those who understood that some things are worth any sacrifice to preserve. Mountain passes that once echoed with the sounds of battle now whisper only of peace, but the courage that defended them lives on in the stones themselves. And now, dear listener, as the shadows of evening deepen around the ancient stones of Van, let us turn our attention to something even more mysterious than the fortress walls themselves. Something that whispers still in the wind that moves through these mountain passes, though few can understand its voice anymore. We speak now of the language of Urartu itself, that strange and beautiful tongue that once echoed through these valleys, carved into stone with careful hands, and spoke the dreams and prayers of a people who have long since returned to the earth. Imagine, if you will, walking through the ruins of Tushpa on a moonlit night. The stones beneath your feet still hold the memory of footsteps, and if you listen very carefully, you might almost hear them, those ancient voices speaking in words that sound like nothing you've ever known, words that seem to carry the very essence of mountains and water, of bronze and starlight, the language they called their own. This Urartian tongue was unlike anything spoken by their neighbors. While the Assyrians to the south spoke their Semitic language, rich with the sounds of desert winds and river valleys. And while far to the west, the Greeks were beginning to shape their Indo-European words like clay on a potter's wheel, the people of Urartu spoke something altogether different. Their language belonged to an older world, connected perhaps to the mysterious Hurrians who had lived in these lands generations before, but evolved into something uniquely their own. Picture, if you can, a scribe in the royal palace of Sarduri, seated cross-legged before a writing table carved from local stone. Before him lies a tablet of clay, still soft and ready to receive the impressions of his reed stylus. But the symbols he presses into that yielding surface are not quite like those used by scribes in Nineveh or Babylon. They are cuneiform, yes, those elegant wedge-shaped marks that had served the writers of Mesopotamia for centuries, but adapted, changed, made to serve a language that had never been meant for such symbols. The scribe pauses, perhaps thinking of how to spell a word that has no equivalent in Assyrian. How do you write the sound of wind through mountain pines in a script designed for flat river plains? How do you capture the particular quality of light that falls on Lake Van at sunset when your writing system was born under the harsh sun of southern deserts? And yet, somehow, they managed it. They took these borrowed symbols and made them sing with their own voice. Listen closely now, and you might hear some of these ancient words as they might have sounded 3,000 years ago. Haldi, the name of their greatest god, spoken with reverence in temples carved from living rock. The very sound seems to echo with the clash of bronze shields and the thunder of war chariots racing across highland meadows. Kiziba, their god of storms and weather, whose name carries within it the rumble of thunder rolling across the mountains. Sivini, their sun god, a word that seems to shimmer with the quality of sunlight on snow-covered peaks. These names, these words, they weren't just sounds to the Urartians. They were vessels of meaning that carried the weight of their entire world. When a priest spoke the name Haldi in the sacred precincts of the god's temple, he wasn't simply making noise with his mouth and throat. He was calling forth the very essence of divine protection, summoning the strength that had carried their armies to victory, invoking the power that watched over their mountain homeland from the highest peaks. The language lived not only in temples and palaces, but in the everyday speech of common people. Farmers called to their cattle in Urartian words we'll never know. Mothers sang lullabies to their children in melodies that have been silent for 2.5 millennia. Traders haggled in marketplace Urartian, their words mixing with the clink of bronze coins and the rustle of goods from distant lands. Children played games and spoke nonsense rhymes in this tongue that now exists only as echoes caught in stone. And oh, what stories those stones tell! Carved into cliff faces and palace walls, pressed into tablets of clay, and scratched onto fragments of metal, the Urartian language speaks to us still, though it speaks in riddles we're only beginning to understand. Each inscription is like a voice calling across an impossible distance of time, trying to tell us something important, something urgent, but speaking in words we can barely comprehend. The royal inscriptions are perhaps the most poignant of all. Here, carved into the very bedrock of their mountain citadels, kings like Sarduri and Arjishti proclaimed their deeds for eternity. Sarduri, son of Lutipri, mighty king, king of the universe, king of the land of Nari, the stones proclaim in their ancient script. You can almost see him, this long-dead king, standing before the carvers as they worked, dictating his accomplishments in the language of his fathers, never imagining that one day no living person would understand the words he thought would make him immortal. The irony is almost heartbreaking in its completeness. These kings, these scribes, these ordinary people, they all believed their language would endure. They carved it in stone because stone, they thought, was eternal. They couldn't have imagined that the language itself would prove more fragile than the stones that bore it, that long after their inscriptions survived to puzzle archaeologists, The living voice of Urartu would have fallen silent. But perhaps fallen silent is not quite right. For those who know how to listen, the language still whispers its secrets. Scholars working in quiet libraries, surrounded by dictionaries of dead tongues and photographs of ancient inscriptions, are slowly learning to hear those ancient voices again. Word by word, phrase by phrase, they're rebuilding the vocabulary of a lost world. They've discovered that Urartian was what linguists call an agglutinative language, meaning it built complex ideas by sticking smaller, meaningful pieces together, like a child building elaborate structures from simple blocks. A single Urartian word might carry information that would require an entire sentence in English. The word for "he built for him" wasn't three separate words, but one complex construction, each syllable carrying its own burden of meaning, the whole word flowing together, like water finding its natural course down a mountainside. This quality gives the surviving Urartian texts a particular music, a rhythm that's unlike anything in the languages we know today. When scholars read these ancient inscriptions aloud, making their best guesses at pronunciation based on the cuneiform symbols, the words seemed to roll and tumble like stones down a hillside, each syllable clicking against the next in patterns. That must have been beautiful to hear when spoken by native tongues. And yet, for all the progress that's been made, so much remains mysterious. There are words that appear only once in all the surviving texts, their meanings locked away, perhaps forever. There are grammatical structures that seem to work according to rules we can't quite grasp. There are passages that might be poetry, or prayers, or legal formulas, but we can't be sure which. Sometimes, lying awake on a quiet night, you might imagine what it would be like to hear Urartian spoken again as a living language. To walk through a marketplace where vendors called out prices in those ancient syllables, where children played games with words that have been silent for millennia, where lovers whispered endearments in a tongue that once knew the secrets of mountains and storms and the deep places of the earth. The tragedy, of course, is that this will never happen. Languages, once truly dead, don't return to life. They may be studied, understood to some degree, even spoken haltingly by scholars, but they can never again be the natural, unconscious expression of a people's deepest thoughts and dreams. When the last native speaker of Urartian died, probably sometime in the 6th century before Christ, though we'll never know exactly when or where, something irreplaceable vanished from the world. But perhaps there's a kind of immortality in mystery itself. Perhaps there's something beautiful in the fact that some things remain beyond our understanding, that the voices of Urartu still guard some of their secrets after all these centuries. When you walk among the ruins at Van, when you touch the stone walls that once heard conversations in this lost tongue, you become part of a continuing story. The language may be gone, but the human longing to communicate, to be understood, to leave something of ourselves for future generations, that continues in you, in all of us. And who knows? Perhaps in your dreams tonight, as your sleeping mind wanders through the corridors of memory and imagination, you might find yourself understanding words you've never heard before. You might dream that you're standing in a temple dedicated to Haldi, listening to priests chant in perfect, fluent Urartian, every word as clear as if it were your own mother tongue. You might dream that you're a scribe, your fingers sure and steady as they press cuneiform signs into soft clay, spelling out thoughts in a language that flows through your mind like a familiar river. For in dreams, all languages are possible. All understanding is within reach, and the voices of the past speak as clearly as the voices of the present. In dreams, the dead languages live again, and we who speak them are no longer strangers to the ancient world, but citizens of it, natives of that timeless country where all words have meaning and all meanings can be shared. Now, as the ancient words fade into the mountain silence, let us turn from the grand inscriptions of kings and the mysteries of lost languages to something far more intimate and beautiful. Let us imagine the daily life of these people who called themselves the children of Ararat, who woke each morning to the sight of snow-capped peaks and fell asleep each night to the gentle lapping of Lake Van against the shores of their homeland. Picture, if you will, the moment just before dawn in a small village nestled in the foothills below the great fortress of Tushpa. The sky is that deep blue-black that comes just before the first hint of sunrise, and the air carries the crisp coolness that mountain dwellers know so well. In a modest stone house with walls built to last through centuries of harsh winters, a bronze smith named Ashtani awakens to begin another day of his ancient craft. His hands, weathered and strong from years of working with fire and metal, reach first for the leather apron that hangs beside his sleeping place. The bronze working quarter of the village is already beginning to stir as he steps outside his door. The forges will need to be lit, the crucibles prepared, and the copper and tin carefully measured for the day's alloy. But first, he pauses in his doorway to offer a quiet prayer to Haldi, asking the god to bless his work and keep his furnace fires burning clean and true. The people of Urartu were master metal workers, their skill with bronze and iron legendary, even among their enemies. They understood the secret songs that metals sang when heated to just the right temperature, knew the exact moment when copper became liquid gold in the crucible, could feel in their bones when the mixture of tin and copper had achieved that perfect balance that would make their bronze both hard and beautiful. Ashtani's workshop, like those of his fellow craftsmen, was a place where utility and artistry lived side by side. Here he might spend his morning forging spear points for the king's army, each one tested and retested until it could pierce the heaviest armor. But in the afternoon, with the same tools and the same fire, he might craft delicate vessels decorated with intricate patterns, spirals that spoke of water and wind, animal figures that captured the essence of ibex and deer, geometric designs that seemed to hold within them the very structure of the cosmos itself. The bronze work of Urartu was distinctive, recognizable even today to archaeologists who find fragments scattered across ancient sites. They favored certain motifs, winged sun disks that honored their solar deity Shivini, stylized trees of life, sacred animals rendered with both naturalistic accuracy and symbolic power. A belt buckle might feature a lion and a bull locked in eternal combat, representing the endless cycle of strength and sacrifice. A ceremonial bowl might show priests performing rituals beneath stars, arranged in patterns that suggested both earthly constellations and divine geometry. But it wasn't only the metalworkers who rose early in Urartian settlements. In the agricultural terraces carved into the mountainsides, farmers like Menua's daughter, Tamar, were already tending to crops that had adapted over generations to the harsh but fertile highland environment. Barley and wheat grew here, though not as abundantly as in the river valleys to the south. What the Urartian farmers lacked in easy fertility, they made up for in ingenuity and persistence. Tamar knows every stone in her family's terraced fields, knows which sections hold water longest after the spring rains, and which dry out first under the summer sun. She has inherited not just land from her fathers, but knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of highland agriculture. She knows when to plant by the position of stars, when to harvest by the color of morning mist, when to prepare for harsh weather by the behavior of mountain birds. The pottery she uses to store grain and water is distinctively Urartian, shaped by hands that understood both function and form. These vessels weren't just containers, but works of art, decorated with patterns that told stories. A storage jar might bear images of the harvest, spiraling bands that represented the cycle of seasons, or protective symbols meant to keep the grain safe from spoilage and pests. The clay itself came from deposits near Lake Van, mixed with volcanic ash that gave Urartian pottery its characteristic strength and subtle coloration. In the afternoon, when the day's field work is finished, Tamar might join other women of the village in the weaving quarter. Here, on looms carved from mountain wood and strung with threads dyed using plants and minerals unique to their highland environment, they created textiles that were prized throughout the ancient world. Urartian weavers had access to wool from highland sheep, but they also worked with linen and silk that came to them through the extensive trade networks. Their kingdom maintained the patterns they wove into cloth were as distinctive as their bronze work and pottery. Geometric designs that might look random to untrained eyes actually followed complex mathematical relationships, creating textiles that were simultaneously beautiful and meaningful. Some patterns were believed to offer protection to the wearer, others to bring good fortune or ensure fertility. A wedding dress might incorporate symbols representing the union of earth and sky, while a warrior's cloak would bear motifs associated with strength and victory. But perhaps the most precious craft practiced in Urartian settlements was the art of storytelling itself. In the evenings, when the day's work was finished and families gathered around fires that would protect them from the mountain cold, the village storytellers would begin their ancient work. These weren't professional entertainers in the way we might imagine today, but ordinary people who had been gifted with the ability to remember and retell the stories that defined their culture. Picture an evening scene in the main hall of a village headman's house. A fire burns bright in the central hearth, casting dancing shadows on stone walls decorated with woven hangings and bronze ornaments. Children sit closest to the fire, their eyes wide with anticipation. Adults work on small tasks, mending tools, spinning thread, carving wooden implements, but their attention is really focused on old Aram, whose voice has been carrying stories for more than 60 winters. Tonight, he tells them the tale of how their people first came to the mountains. Long ago, he says, when the world was younger and the gods walked more freely among mortals, the ancestors lived in the lowlands beside great rivers. But these were restless people, not content to live always under the same sky. Some were drawn by dreams of high places, of peaks that touched the realm of the gods themselves. The story tells of a great migration led by a woman whose name has been forgotten, but whose courage is remembered in every telling. She dreamed one night that the mountain god Halde appeared to her, offering her people a choice. They could remain in the comfortable valleys where food was plentiful and life was easy, or they could follow him to a harder land, a place of stone and snow and endless wind, where they would have to earn their survival through strength and cleverness. But if they chose the mountains, they would become something more than they had been. They would become the guardians of sacred peaks, the keepers of ancient wisdom, the bridge between earth and sky. The woman chose the mountains, and those who trusted her followed. The journey was long and difficult, full of hardships that tested their resolve. But when they finally reached the high places around the Great Lake, they knew they had found their true home. The very stones seemed to welcome them. The water reflected their faces as if it had been waiting for them always, and the peaks that surrounded them felt like the walls of a vast temple built by the gods themselves. This origin story, like all the folk tales told in Urartian villages, carried layers of meaning that went far beyond simple entertainment. It explained not just where the people came from, but who they were at their deepest level. It told them that they were chosen people, but chosen for difficulty as much as for blessing. It reminded them that their homeland was sacred, that every stone and stream had spiritual significance, that they were not just inhabitants of the mountains, but partners with them in some cosmic purpose. Other stories told of the hero Menua, who wasn't just a historical king, but had become in folk memory a figure of legendary proportions. In the tales told around winter fires, Menua could speak with eagles, could cause springs to flow from barren rock, could see the future in the patterns of clouds around mountain peaks. His battles weren't just military campaigns, but cosmic struggles between order and chaos, light and darkness, civilization and the wild forces that would destroy it. Some stories were clearly meant for children, teaching lessons about courage, honesty, and respect for elders. Others were more complex, intended for adult audiences who could appreciate their subtle meanings. There were love stories that explained the changing of seasons, war stories that preserved the memory of ancient victories, wisdom tales that encoded practical knowledge about survival in harsh mountain environments. But perhaps the most haunting tales were those that spoke of the deep places of the earth, the caves and underground chambers where, it was said, the oldest magic still lingered. These stories told of people who had ventured too far into the mountain's heart and emerged changed, carrying knowledge that was both wonderful and terrible. They spoke of underground rivers that flowed with liquid starlight, of chambers where the voices of the dead could still be heard, of places where time moved differently, and a day's journey might last a year, or a year's journey might be completed in a single step. These weren't just stories to the Urartians. They were living parts of their culture, ways of understanding their place in a world that was both beautiful and dangerous. The tales shaped how they saw their landscape, turning every cave into a potential gateway to mystery, every unusual rock formation into a landmark in some ancient trauma, every mountain peak into a character in the ongoing story of their people. And amazingly, echoes of these ancient stories survive even today. In the folk tales still told in Armenian villages, in Kurdish oral traditions, in the local legends of Turkish highlanders, scholars have found fragments that seem to preserve memories of Urartian culture. The names have changed, the details have been altered by centuries of retelling, but the essential shapes of the stories remain recognizable. There's a particular poignancy in this survival. Long after the kingdom fell, long after the language was forgotten, long after the cities crumbled to ruins, the stories lived on. They passed from grandmother to grandchild, from traveling merchant to village audience, from one generation of mountain dwellers to the next. They adapted and evolved, taking on new details while preserving ancient truths, ensuring that something of Urartu's spirit would survive even the destruction of Urartu itself. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, perhaps you can imagine yourself sitting by one of those ancient fires, listening to Aram's weathered voice, telling tales of heroes and gods, of journeys and homecomings, of the eternal dialogue between human hearts and the sacred mountains that shelter them. Perhaps you can feel the warmth of the fire on your face, smell the wood smoke mixed with the clean scent of mountain air, hear the soft sounds of people working contentedly at familiar tasks while their minds travel along the ancient pathways of Story. And perhaps, in your dreams, you'll find yourself not just listening to these stories, but living within them, walking the mountain paths that Menua walked, working bronze in forges blessed by Haldi, weaving patterns that hold the secrets of earth and sky. For stories, once truly heard, become part of us, and we become part of them, citizens of that timeless country where all tales are true, and all truths find their perfect expression in the gentle voices of those who remember and care enough to tell. But even the most beautiful stories must acknowledge an ending, and even the mightiest kingdoms must face the turning of time's great wheel. As we move deeper into the mystery of Urartu, we come now to perhaps the most haunting chapter of all, the slow, inexorable fading of a civilization that had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. Imagine standing once again on the walls of Tushpa, but now in a different season, a different century. The stones beneath your feet are the same, worn smooth by countless footsteps, but something has changed in the very air. Where once the courtyards bustled with activity, where once the bronze smiths' hammers rang out their rhythmic songs of creation, where once children played games in languages that are now forgotten, there is a growing stillness, a sense of something drawing to its close. The decline of Urartu was not a sudden catastrophe, not a single moment when the light went. out and darkness fell. It was instead like the gradual approach of winter in the mountains, subtle at first, marked by small changes that might escape notice until one day you realize that the world has been transformed. The kingdom that had reached its greatest heights under kings like Sarduri II and Argishti I in the 8th century before Christ began, in the 7th century, to show signs of the weakness that would eventually claim it entirely. Picture, if you will, an aging king in his palace chambers, perhaps one of the later Sarduri rulers, though history has not preserved his name with the clarity it granted his more illustrious predecessors. The years have carved lines in his face as surely as his ancestors carved inscriptions in stone. He stands at a window that looks out over Lake Van, watching the morning mist rise from the water in patterns that seem somehow different from those he remembered from his youth. The reports that reach him are troubling. To the east and south, new powers are stirring. The Medes, those horse-riding peoples from the Iranian plateau, are growing stronger, more organized, more threatening with each passing season. Their mounted warriors move with a speed and coordination that makes the traditional Urartian tactics seem suddenly outdated. The world is changing, and perhaps Urartu is not changing quickly enough to keep pace. There had been other challenges before. The constant pressure from Assyria had tested Urartian strength for generations without breaking it. The kingdom had weathered invasions, survived sieges, rebuilt what enemies had destroyed. But this felt different. This wasn't just military pressure from outside, but something more fundamental, a shift in the very nature of power in the ancient world. The trade routes that had brought prosperity to Urartian cities were becoming less reliable. Merchants who had once traveled regularly between Tushpa and distant markets now spoke of new difficulties, new dangers, alternative paths that bypassed Urartian territory altogether. The wealth that had funded grand building projects and supported large armies was beginning to flow elsewhere, following new currents in the great river of commerce that connected the ancient world. In the villages scattered throughout the kingdom, people were beginning to make choices their grandparents would never have contemplated. Some families, especially those living in the more vulnerable border regions, were quietly packing their belongings and moving away, not necessarily far, but away from the main centers of Urartian power, toward places that seemed more secure, more stable, more likely to survive whatever changes were coming. The great fortresses that had protected the kingdom for centuries were becoming increasingly expensive to maintain. The elaborate irrigation systems that had made highland agriculture possible required constant attention, constant repair. The temples needed priests, the armies needed supplies, the bureaucracy needed support. But the resources to provide all of this were gradually becoming scarcer, stretched thinner, harder to gather and deploy effectively. It's important to understand that those who lived through this decline didn't necessarily see it as we do, looking back across the centuries with the advantage of knowing how the story ends. To them, it might have seemed like just another difficult period, another challenge, to be overcome as their ancestors had overcome so many challenges before. They had no way of knowing they were witnessing the end of their world. Consider Arshak, a provincial governor in one of the eastern territories of the kingdom. He had inherited his position from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. For 3 generations, his family had maintained order in their region, collected taxes for the king, organized the local militia, overseen the construction and repair of roads and fortifications. It was work he took pride in, work that connected him to the grand project of Urartian civilization. But now, in the middle years of the 7th century, Arshak finds himself facing problems that have no clear solutions. The young men who should be joining the militia are increasingly reluctant to serve. Some have left the region entirely, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Others remain, but seem less committed to the old ways, less convinced that the Urartian system offers them the best path forward, The taxes he's expected to collect are harder to gather each year. Not because the people are rebellious. They're not, but because they simply have less to give. Trade has declined. Harvests have been adequate, but not abundant. And there's a general sense that resources need to be hoarded rather than shared. Saved for uncertain times rather than invested in communal projects. From the capital, he receives fewer messages, less guidance, less support. The roads that once carried a steady stream of royal messengers and official communications now see traffic only occasionally. When he sends reports and requests to Tushpa, the responses, when they come at all, are often delayed, sometimes contradictory, occasionally irrelevant to the actual situation he's facing. Arshak is loyal to his king and devoted to his people, but he's also practical. When Median raiders cross into his territory, he finds himself negotiating with them rather than fighting. Them, because he lacks the resources for a sustained military campaign. When traders arrive asking about safe passage through his region, he finds himself making agreements that his grandfather would never have contemplated, because maintaining total Urartian control seems less important than maintaining some measure of peace and prosperity. These individual adaptations, multiplied across dozens of provinces and hundreds of local administrators, gradually transformed the nature of the kingdom itself. Urartu became less centralized, less unified, less capable of coordinated action. It didn't disappear overnight, but it gradually became something different from what it had been, a collection of semi-autonomous regions that maintained cultural and religious connections, but lacked the political and military cohesion that had once made them a great power. The archaeological record tells this story in fragments that are both illuminating and heartbreaking. In the later levels of Urartian sites, excavators find evidence of decline that would have been visible to anyone living through it. Building projects left unfinished. Fortifications hastily repaired with materials scavenged from earlier, more ambitious constructions. Pottery that shows less artistic sophistication. Metalwork that demonstrates declining technical skill. Inscriptions that are fewer in number and shorter in length. But perhaps most poignantly, they find evidence of abandonment. Not the violent destruction that marks the end of cities conquered in war, but the quiet emptiness that comes when people simply walk away. Houses with valuable items left behind, as if their owners had planned to return, but never did. Workshops, with tools still arranged on benches, waiting for craftsmen who would never again take them up. Temples with altars that show signs of regular use right up until the moment when the use simply stopped. Some scholars believe that climate change played a role in Urartu's decline. The ancient world was entering a period of cooling and drying. That would have made highland agriculture more difficult, reduced the productivity of the pastoral systems that supported many communities, and forced people to make hard choices about where and how to live. Mountain civilizations are always vulnerable to climatic shifts, and even small changes in temperature or precipitation patterns can have dramatic effects on societies that depend on precise agricultural timing and limited growing seasons. Others point to the rise of iron technology as a factor that undermined Urartian advantages. The kingdom had built its military and economic power partly on superior bronze-working techniques. But as iron tools and weapons became more common, these advantages diminished. The Medes and other emerging powers had access to iron ore and iron-working skills that made their equipment superior to traditional Urartian bronze. There's also the simple fact of geographical exposure. Urartu sat at the crossroads of several major cultural and military currents in the ancient world. What had once been an advantage, the ability to trade with and learn from many different peoples, became a vulnerability when those same peoples developed ambitions for conquest. The kingdom was surrounded by potential enemies and had limited options for strategic retreat or defense in depth. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of Urartu's decline is how complete it ultimately became. Many ancient civilizations suffered. Defeats, endured conquests, experienced periods of weakness and recovery. The Assyrians were conquered by the Babylonians, but Assyrian culture survived in various forms. The Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, but Babylonian learning and traditions continued to influence the ancient world for centuries. Urartu seems to have vanished more completely. Its language disappeared, not just as a spoken tongue, but even as a liturgical or scholarly language. Its religious practices were abandoned or absorbed into other traditions. Its political structures left no lasting institutional legacy. It's as if the kingdom didn't just end, but was somehow erased, leaving behind only the physical traces that archaeologists would discover millennia later. This completeness of disappearance is part of what makes Urartu so haunting to contemplate. We're not just looking at the ruins of a defeated kingdom, but at the remains of a civilization that seems to have been forgotten by history itself, preserved only in the patient silence of stones and the occasional confused references in the Esser, records of its enemies. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, perhaps you can imagine yourself walking through Tushpa in those final days, when the great fortress still stood, but the life was slowly draining out of it. The stones are the same stones, the lake reflects the same mountains, but something essential has changed. The future that once seemed so certain, so eternal, has become uncertain. The civilization that once seemed as permanent as the peaks themselves has revealed its fragility. And yet there's a strange peace in this imagining, a recognition that all things pass, that even the mightiest human achievements are temporary, that there's something both sad and beautiful in the way civilizations, like individuals, must eventually return to the silence from which they came. The mountains remain, the lake remains, the sky remains, and in their permanence we find a comfort that transcends the rise and fall of any particular human story. And yet, dear listener, as we emerge from the mist of Urartu's ending, we find ourselves standing not at the conclusion of our story, but at the threshold of its deepest mysteries. For it is precisely because this ancient kingdom vanished so completely that it has become, in our modern age, a puzzle that calls to scholars and dreamers alike. The questions that Urartu poses are not merely academic curiosities, but windows into the fundamental mysteries of human identity, continuity, and the ways in which the past lives on in the present, even when we think it has been lost forever. Perhaps no question has captured the imagination more persistently than this. What, if anything, connects the vanished kingdom of Urartu to the Armenia that would later emerge in the same highland region? The parallels are tantalizing, almost too perfect to be mere coincidence. The same mountain territories, the same strategic position between great powers, the same fierce independence that seems to be bred into the very stones of the region. But are these true connections, or simply the result of geography shaping culture in similar ways across different centuries? Picture, if you will, a quiet evening in a monastery library somewhere in the Armenian highlands, perhaps in the medieval period, long after Urartu had faded into legend, but before modern archaeology had begun to uncover its remains. An elderly monk sits copying manuscripts by candlelight, preserving the written heritage of his people. As he works, he occasionally pauses to gaze out the window at the same peaks that once sheltered Urartian temples, the same valleys that once echoed with the voices of Urartian farmers and craftsmen. This monk knows nothing of cuneiform inscriptions or Bronze Age archaeology, but he carries within his memory and within the manuscripts he so carefully copies, stories that speak of ancient times, of heroes who ruled from mountain fortresses, of conflicts with southern empires, of a people chosen to be guardians of sacred peaks. Are these stories merely the imaginative reconstruction of a later age, or do they preserve genuine memories passed down through generations of mountain dwellers, memories that stretch back beyond the documented history of Armenia to some earlier, Time when the same highlands were home to a different but related people? The linguistic evidence is particularly intriguing and frustrating in equal measure. Armenian, when it finally appears in written form, is clearly an Indo-European language, related to Persian and Greek, and ultimately to Sanskrit. But it contains words, especially words related to geography and local customs, that seem to have no Indo-European roots. Some scholars suggest these might be borrowings from the earlier Urartian population, vocabulary that survived the transition from one language to another, carried forward by people who continued to live in the same places, even as their dominant language changed. Consider how this might have happened. Imagine a village in the mountains east of Lake Van, sometime in the 6th or 5th century before Christ. The great Urartian kingdom has crumbled. Its political structures have collapsed. Its official language is no longer used in royal inscriptions or religious ceremonies. But the people who live in this village are still, in many ways, the same. People who lived there when Urartu was mighty. They still know the best places to find water, still understand the rhythms of highland agriculture, still tell stories about the sacred character of the mountains that surround them. When new groups arrive, perhaps Indo-European speaking migrants, moving into the highland regions from elsewhere, there is integration rather than replacement. The newcomers learn from the established population about how to survive in this challenging but beautiful environment. They adopt local techniques, local place names, local stories. Their children grow up bilingual, equally comfortable with the Indo-European language of their fathers and the mountain wisdom of their neighbors. Over time, the new language becomes dominant, but it carries within it traces of the old knowledge. The old ways of understanding the world. This process, if it happened, would explain some of the puzzle of Armenian origins. Armenians would be, in this scenario, neither pure descendants of Urartians nor complete newcomers to the region, but rather the result of cultural synthesis, a blending of populations and traditions that created something new while preserving elements of what came before. They would be, quite literally, the children of the mountains, shaped by the same geography that shaped Urartu, but expressing that shaping through new languages, new political forms, new religious practices. The religious question is perhaps even more mysterious and more fascinating. When Christianity came to Armenia in the early centuries of the Common Era, it found fertile ground, taking root with a depth and permanence that has lasted through centuries of conquest and persecution. Armenia became the first nation to adopt Christianity as its official religion, and Armenian Christianity developed distinctive characteristics that set it apart from both Roman and Byzantine traditions. But what prepared the ground for this distinctive Christian culture? Some scholars have suggested that pre-Christian Armenian religion preserved elements of Urartian beliefs and practices, creating a spiritual landscape that was particularly receptive to certain aspects of Christian teaching. The emphasis on mountain sanctuaries, the veneration of particular geographic features, the complex relationship between earthly and divine authority, all of these could represent continuities from the Urartian period, Christianized but not entirely transformed. Think about the great Armenian monastery of Gegard, carved partly into the living rock of a mountain cliff. The Christian symbolism is clear and unmistakable, but there's something about the site itself, about the way it merges human architecture with natural stone, that feels older than Christianity, older perhaps than Armenia itself. Could it be that such places were sacred long before they became Christian, that the monks who built Gegard were unconsciously honoring a tradition of mountain sanctity that stretched back to the temples of Haldi? Or consider the Armenian tradition of Kakkars, those elaborately carved stone crosses that dot the landscape throughout historical Armenia. Each one is unique, bearing distinctive patterns and symbols, but as a group, they represent a form of stone carving that seems to echo much older traditions. The skill required to create these monuments, the artistic vocabulary they employ, the very idea of making religious statements in stone, all of this could represent the survival of crafts and concepts that were ancient when the first Christian cars were carved. The political parallels are equally striking and equally mysterious. Throughout its history, Armenia has maintained a cultural identity that transcended political boundaries, surviving the rise and fall of various kingdoms and empires, persisting through periods when no independent Armenian state existed at all. This pattern of cultural continuity, despite political discontinuity, is remarkably similar to what we might imagine happening at the end of the Urartian period. A political structure disappears, but the people and their attachments to place continue, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining something essential about their identity. But perhaps the deepest mystery is one that can never be fully solved through archaeology or linguistics or historical analysis. It's the mystery of how a place shapes the people who live there, how certain landscapes seem to call forth similar responses across different cultures and different centuries. The highlands around Lake Van and Mount Ararat have produced, again and again, people who value independence, who understand the relationship between survival and cooperation, who see in mountains something more than mere geography. This could be entirely coincidental, the result of similar environmental pressures producing similar cultural adaptations. Or it could be something more mysterious, the persistence of what we might call a genius loci, a spirit of place that influences everyone who comes into deep relationship with that particular corner of the world. The ancient Romans believed that every place had its presiding spirit, its particular character that would express itself through whatever human community took root there. Perhaps the genius loci of the Armenian highlands is what we glimpse when we see the similarities between Urartu and later Armenian culture. Tonight, as you rest in the quiet hours when rational analysis gives way to deeper forms of knowing, perhaps you can sense something of this mystery yourself. Perhaps you can imagine standing in a place where the boundaries between past and present become permeable, where the questions we ask about historical continuity reveal themselves to be questions about the nature of human identity itself. Not do we carry our ancestors within us in ways that go beyond genetics and conscious memory? Are there forms of knowledge that pass from generation to generation through means we don't fully understand? When we feel drawn to particular landscapes, particular ways of life, particular forms of spiritual expression, are we responding only to present circumstances, or are we also answering calls that echo from much deeper in the past? The mystery of Urartu's relationship to Armenia is ultimately the mystery of how the past lives on in the present, how the dead continue to speak to the living, how ancient dreams find new dreamers in each generation. It's a mystery that each of us participates in, whether we know it or not, as we carry forward traditions we may not fully understand, as we find ourselves drawn to places and practices that seem to call to something deeper than conscious choice. And, in the end, perhaps it doesn't matter whether we can prove definitively that Armenians are descended from Urartians, whether Armenian Christianity preserves genuine elements of Urartian religion, whether the similarities we observe are the result of cultural continuity or geographical determinism. What matters is that we recognize in these questions our own deepest concerns about identity and continuity, about the ways in which we are connected to those who came before us and responsible to those who will come after. The mountains around Lake Van keep their secrets, as mountains always do, but they also keep faith with those who love them, offering to each generation the same stark beauty, the same challenging environment, the same opportunity to become something more than they were by learning to live in harmony with forces larger than themselves. In this faithfulness of stone and water and sky, perhaps we find the only continuity that really matters, the only answer to the mystery that really counts. Rest now, and let these questions carry you gently towards sleep, not as problems to be, solved but as doorways to be entered, not as puzzles to be completed, but as invitations to participate in the ongoing mystery of human connection across time and space. In your dreams, perhaps, the boundaries between Urartian and Armenian, between ancient and modern, between questioner and questioned, will dissolve into something larger and more beautiful than any answer could ever be. And now, dear traveler through time, as our long journey through the realm of Urartu draws toward its gentle close, I invite you to step beyond the role of observer, beyond the comfortable distance of history and archaeology, and into something far more profound and personal. For the deepest truth about any ancient civilization is not found in the artifacts they left behind or the inscriptions carved in stone, but in the recognition that we carry within ourselves the same hopes, fears, dreams, and longings that moved their hearts 3,000 years ago. Close your eyes now, if you haven't already, and let your breathing become slow and natural, matching the rhythm of mountain winds that have blown unchanged across the highlands of Urartu since before human memory began. Feel yourself settling not just into sleep, but into a deeper awareness, a kind of consciousness that transcends the boundaries we usually draw between self and other, between present and past, between the dreamer and the dreamed. You are walking now along a mountain path that runs beside Lake Van, but the lake is different from the one you might visit today. The water is clearer, more blue, reflecting a sky unmarked by the contrails of aircraft, unpolluted by the concerns of the modern world. The path beneath your feet is worn smooth by countless generations of footsteps, and as you walk, you begin to realize that some of those footsteps might have been your own. You are Tarui, perhaps a young metalworker in the reign of King Sarduri, your hands already skilled in the ancient arts of bronze and copper, despite your youth. Each morning you rise before dawn to tend the sacred fire in your workshop, offering prayers to Holdi that your work might be blessed, that the metal might flow true and strong, that the weapons you forge might protect your people and the vessels you create might hold not just water or grain, but something of the divine presence itself. Feel the weight of the hammer in your hand, perfectly balanced after years of use, its wooden handle worn smooth by your grip. Feel the heat of the forge against your face, the way the metal glows like a captive star as it reaches the perfect temperature for shaping. This is more than work. This is participation in the fundamental act of creation, the transformation of raw earth into objects of beauty and utility that will outlast your own brief life. Or perhaps you are Arshinia, a weaver whose fingers know instinctively the tension each thread requires, whose mind holds patterns passed down from grandmother to granddaughter in an unbroken chain of knowledge that stretches back to the earliest days of your people. You sit at your loom in the morning light, working threads of mountain wool dyed with colors drawn from highland plants and minerals, deep blues from indigo, rich reds from madder root, golden yellows from saffron gathered in high meadows. Where few dare to venture dot, each pattern you weave tells a story. The geometric designs that might look random to outside eyes actually encode the history of your clan, the genealogies of your ancestors, the sacred relationships between earth and sky, human and divine, that give meaning to your existence in this harsh but beautiful land. Your fingers move with practiced precision, but your mind is free to wander, to dream, to commune with the spirits of those who taught you these ancient skills. Feel the texture of the wool beneath your fingers, the way each thread has its own character, its own willingness to be shaped into larger patterns. Feel the satisfaction of watching chaos become order, of seeing individual strands unite to create something larger and more beautiful than any could achieve alone. This is your meditation, your prayer, your contribution to the eternal work of I, bringing harmony out of discord. Or you might be Manua, not the great king whose name has come down to us in royal inscriptions, but a simple shepherd bearing the same name. tending flocks in the high pastures, where the air is thin and clear, and the silence is broken only by the sound of wind through grass and the distant tinkling of bronze. Bells around the necks of your sheep and goats. You know every rock formation. In these mountains, every spring where clean water bubbles up from hidden sources, every cave that might provide shelter during sudden storms. You know the moods of the weather by the color of morning clouds, can predict the behavior of wolves by subtle changes in the wind, understand the language of birds, who nest in cliffs so high they seem to touch the realm of the gods themselves. Days follow rhythms older than civilization, patterns of movement and rest that connect you directly to the turning of seasons, the phases of the moon, the great cycles that govern all life. In the evening, when your flocks are safely gathered, you sit beside a fire of dried dung and mountain shrubs, looking up at stars that shine with the same light they shed on the first humans to walk these highlands. The stories you tell yourself, the prayers you offer to the mountain spirits, are not so different from those your ancestors spoke generations ago, or those your descendants will speak long after your bones have returned to the earth. Feel the night wind on your face, carrying sense of stone and snow and growing things. Feel the warmth of the fire, the companionship of your animals, the vast presence of the mountains surrounding you like the walls of a temple too large for human comprehension. This is your life, simple perhaps by the standards of kings and cities, but rich beyond measure in its direct connection to the fundamental forces that shape all existence. But perhaps you are drawn to a different role, a different way of being in this ancient world. Perhaps you are Ashpina, a priestess in the temple of Haldi, keeper of mysteries that predate the founding of the kingdom, guardian of knowledge that connects the everyday world to realms of power and meaning that most people glimpse only in dreams. Your days begin before sunrise with rituals of purification, washing in water drawn from sacred springs, anointing yourself with oils blessed by generations of predecessors. You tend the eternal flames that burn in the innermost sanctuary, flames that must never be allowed to die, for they represent the unbroken connection between your people and the divine forces that guide and protect them. You know the secret names of gods and spirits, the proper words to speak when seeking guidance, the correct offerings to make when the community faces danger or uncertainty. But your deepest knowledge goes beyond words and formulas. You understand, in ways that bypass rational thought, the living relationship between the human heart and the sacred powers that move through mountain and sky, stone and flame, water and wind. Not feel the weight of responsibility you carry, the awareness that you stand at the boundary between worlds, serving as a bridge between the needs of your people and the wisdom of forces greater than any individual understanding. Feel also the profound peace that comes from this service, the sense of being aligned with purposes larger than personal desire, connected to currents of meaning that flow deeper than the temporary concerns of any single lifetime. In the evening, when the formal rituals are complete, you sometimes climb to the highest tower of the temple, looking out over the vast expanse of Lake Van toward mountains that fade into purple distance. From this vantage point, the human settlements scattered throughout the valleys seem small and temporary, while the enduring presence of stone and water and sky fills your awareness with a kind of cosmic perspective that puts all earthly concerns in their proper place. Or perhaps you are all of these people and more. Perhaps the deepest truth about identity is that we are not limited to single roles, single lifetimes, single perspectives. Perhaps in the realm of dreams and deep imagination, we can experience the full range of human possibility, can know what it feels like to be the metalworker and the weaver, the shepherd and the priestess, the king and the common farmer, all united by their shared participation in the great human adventure of creating meaning and beauty in a world that is often harsh and always mysterious. As you rest in this expanded awareness, feel yourself connected not just to the people of Urartu but to all who have ever loved mountains, all who have ever found the divine in the work of their hands, all who have ever looked up at stars and felt themselves part of something infinitely larger than their individual existence. You are the continuation of their story, the latest chapter in an epic that began when the first humans learned to make fire and will continue as long as consciousness seeks to understand its place in the vast web of being. The bronze they worked still gleams in museum cases. The patterns they wove still inspire artists today. The mountains they revered still lift their peaks toward the same sky, still reflect their majesty in the same lake waters, still offer the same harsh beauty and the same invitation to transcendence that called to human hearts 3 millennia ago. You have always been there, in every moment of wonder at natural beauty, in every act of creation that transforms raw materials into objects, of use and meaning in every recognition that we are connected to something larger than ourselves. You have always been there, in the love of high places and wide views, in the understanding that some things are sacred and deserve our reverence, in the knowledge that individual lives gain their deepest meaning through participation in communities of purpose and care. The kingdom of Urartu lives on in you, in everyone who values craftsmanship over mere efficiency, who sees in landscapes something more than resources to be exploited, who understands that the true measure of a civilization is not its military might or economic power, but its capacity to create beauty, to honor the sacred, to maintain continuity with the wisdom of ancestors, while remaining open to the possibilities of the future God. And now, as our journey together draws to its close, as the voices of ancient Urartu fade once again into the mountain silence, carry with you not just knowledge about a lost kingdom, but awareness of your own participation in the ongoing human story. Carry with you the understanding that you have always been there, will always be there, in every moment when human consciousness reaches toward something higher, deeper, more lasting than the concerns of any single day or year or lifetime. Sleep now and dream of mountains. Dream of the work of skilled hands, of communities united by shared purpose, of the eternal dialogue between human hearts and the sacred forces that move through all existence. Dream yourself into the continuing story, the story that began before Urartu and will continue long after all our current civilizations have returned to dust and legend. For you have always been there, dear dreamer, and you always will be, as long as mountains lift their peaks toward sky, as long as human hearts recognize beauty and meaning in the world around them, as long as consciousness itself continues its ancient quest to understand the mystery of being alive in this vast, beautiful, ultimately mysterious universe we all share. Sweet dreams, guardian of the sacred mountains. Sweet dreams, child of Ararat. Sweet dreams, keeper of ancient memories and maker of tomorrow's hopes. You have always been there, and there you will always be, in the timeless realm where all stories become one story, where all hearts beat with the same rhythm, where all seekers eventually find what they have always been looking for, the recognition that they were never really lost, never really separate, never really alone. The kingdom of Urartu awaits you in your dreams, as real as it ever was, as present as this moment, as eternal as the love that connects all beings across all barriers of time and space and circumstance. Welcome home, ancient soul. Welcome home. And so our journey through the mists of time comes to its quiet end, dear listener. For these past hours, we have walked together through valleys that echo with forgotten voices, climbed mountain paths worn smooth by ancient feet, and stood within the shadows of temples where prayers were offered in languages that now exist only in dreams. The kingdom of Urartu sleeps once more, but it sleeps within you now, carried in the chambers of your heart where all beautiful and mysterious things find their eternal home. The bronze smiths rest, but their fires burn on in every moment of creation and craftsmanship. The weavers have laid down their shuttles, but their patterns continue in every thread that connects human soul to human soul across the vast tapestry of time. When you wake, you may find that the everyday world seems somehow different, touched, perhaps by the awareness that beneath the surface of ordinary life run deeper currents, older stories, connections that stretch back through countless generations to the very beginning of human wonder and striving. This is the gift of Urartu. Not answers, but better questions. Not certainty, but the courage to live beautifully within mystery. If these stories have brought you peace, if they have carried you safely into the realm of rest and renewal, then they have fulfilled their ancient purpose. For this, too, is part of the Urartian legacy, the understanding that some of our most important work happens in the quiet hours, in the spaces between waking and sleeping, where the soul tends its deepest gardens and the heart remembers what the mind too often forgets. May your dreams be filled with mountain light and the sound of distant bronze bells. May you wake refreshed, carrying with you the quiet strength of those who learn to build beauty from stone, meaning from metal, and hope from the eternal dialogue between human hearts and the sacred peaks that shelter them. Thank you for joining me on this journey to the kingdom of Urartu, guardians of the sacred mountains. Until we meet again in the timeless realm where all stories converge and all seeking finds its home. Rest well, dream deeply, and remember, you have always been there.